Drawing analogies between the Communist Party of China, officially or abbreviated as the CPC, or in more colloquial terms, the Chinese Communist Party, otherwise known as the CCP, and the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or more simply, the Soviet Union, can be perilous. The similarities between the CCP and the USSR are largely superficial: colors on a flag, and a nominal adherence to an unspecified communist ideology. But the differences are far more salient and far more numerous, if only because the USSR as an entity is defunct, and the CCP is very real indeed. With that said, I don't want to take too much time to discuss the similarities and differences between these organizations, not least of which because it would take away from the main thrust of the video, that being that whatever the differences might be, the CCP represents a far greater threat than the Soviet Union ever did. And they became this threat in part by making use of the so-called free market. Enter Tencent, a Chinese multinational conglomerate that has, bit by bit, and I do mean bit, been buying up the entire digital world, slowly but surely. Now you might be asking the very reasonable question, why does it even matter if a conglomerate of any origin or size decides to invest heavily in a company, or even own a majority of all the shares of said company, since such a thing is just common business practice, and is done everywhere in the world all the time? It is completely normal, to be fair, and in becoming a majority shareholder, or in particular the sole shareholder, a conglomerate can wield great power, and indeed become either the dominant power or the sole power in making important decisions related to said company. One would think that such power, however, would be largely internal and wielded internally for the betterment of profit and expansion of explicit business interests. And that's likely true in most cases. But what happens when a powerful multinational conglomerate is effectively a digital arm of a government organization, specifically a digital arm of the Chinese Communist Party? Well, you get both potentially and actually a different set of directives than would otherwise be in place were said enterprise not incestuously in bed with the government. More importantly, you get Tencent. It is a well-known, almost universally acknowledged fact that free enterprise in China exists only inasmuch as it conforms to the standards and limitations set forth by the CCP, which is to say that even were a business or company not directly holding hands with the CCP, their actions would necessarily have to fall within the restrictions and parameters that the one-party rulers place on them. So, even without direct involvement and/or directives, any Chinese company immediately becomes circumspect in its dealings with the world. Now, you may try to argue that all companies, irrespective of location, have to conform to government mandates and guidelines. And this would be true, and it would vary by country to country. Some of these things might be health guidelines, or might be related to procedure with respect to employees. And yes, in such cases, companies would have to conform to these, but very few companies in the West, perhaps none, would be required to specifically observe political party standards and protocols in order to maintain their continued existence. This is, however, manifestly the case with Chinese-based business entities and the CCP. And one of the primary differences between the CCP and the Soviet Union has been the relentless economic expansionism of Chinese-based enterprises outside of China. Sure, the Soviet Union backed up North Vietnam, Angola, Cuba, and others, but these were not entrepreneurial alliances, and virtually none of them were executed within a free market context. By way of contrast, Chinese business interests, and by logical extension, the CCP, have extended their tendrils to virtually every corner on planet Earth, not solely for ideological reasons, but primarily for the acquisition of both material and financial resources. In short, to gain power. There's not a single continent on planet Earth, save perhaps for Antarctica, that China has not aggressively invested in an expansionist manner, and the key word is China. Likely every country has corporate interests that have invested in every continent at some point in time. But the key difference here is the time frame within which this has been done, with China's economic expansionism having been extremely rapid and rapacious. And since there's no real line drawn between private enterprise and CCP interests, the primary distinction remains one of corporate-driven profit interests on the one hand, in the case of quote-unquote normal businesses, and both profit interests as well as political and or national interests. And by the way, to the best of my knowledge, no specific company on its own has ever unleashed a global pandemic to date. But many of these investments are physical, whether they involve mineral wealth, fossil fuels, or fishing. Yes, even as I speak, the Chinese are overfishing the coasts of West Africa. But these things arguably do not have the same scope of control as do media. Gaming is the largest branch of entertainment in the world. It eclipses film, it eclipses television, and it eclipses sport. And Tencent has its fingers in many, many pies of the gaming world. Some less than others, some more than others. And for some, well, they own the pie. A brief breakdown of percentages with respect to the games the developers represent as of late 2019 is as follows. Riot Games, makers of League of Legends, Tencent owns 100% of the shares. Epic Games, 40%. Blue Hole, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, 11.5%. Ubisoft, 5%. Activision Blizzard, 5%. Grinding Gears Games, Path of Exile, 80%, Supercell, 84.3%, Paradox Interactive, 5%, and there are many, many others, some less well documented, including to some degree, unfortunately, the communication platform otherwise known as Discord. For reasons already discussed, the degree of ownership and involvement on the part of Tencent should be alarming to all of us, because for better or worse, even if it were the case that Tencent's motives were purely profit-driven, as with most conglomerates, the fact that they are subordinate to the Chinese Communist Party renders them de facto compromised. So perhaps you might remember the Blizzard-centered controversy of autumn 2019 when a Hong Kong-based competitive Hearthstone player by the name of Blitzchung expressed his support for the ongoing local protests publicly by stating, "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times." Well, the next day he was banned from the current tournament, required to forfeit any money he had won up until that point, and was further banned from Grandmaster competition for an entire year. And these penalties were widely regarded as excessively harsh, in particular when weighed against lesser penalties issued to other players of Blizzard games for far more vulgar and offensive tones and actions. Recall again that Tencent is a partial owner of Activision Blizzard. Does anyone in their right mind think that neither Tencent nor the CCP had directly or indirectly exerted pressure on Activision Blizzard to quote-unquote do the right thing? The right thing here being to acknowledge the official Chinese Communist Party position that Hong Kong is simply part of China, identical in every respect. And Tencent only owns minimal shares of Blizzard Activision. Now, I'm not claiming that Blizzard Activision did not have their own commercial interests in this. They did. But I think Tencent's involvement here is undeniable. And Tencent has been active in its efforts to suppress information in the digital world. Tencent has investments in Reddit, for example, which is, as likely known, an informal information and image exchange platform for a broader and edgier population than is typical. And as shareholders, Tencent would have access to information that only shareholders can get access to, whether private or otherwise. And being a digital branch of the CCP, they almost certainly freely share that information with the CCP when the occasion demands it. And to cite some research, in 2016, Amnesty International published a report that ranked tech companies on factors like freedom of expression and privacy protection. Tencent came in at rock bottom with a score of 0. The report highlighted that Tencent was the only firm on the list that had never stated that it would refuse the Chinese government's request to share client data. Canadian think tank The Citizen Lab looked at the word and image filtering systems used by Tencent in their popular app WeChat. It found that the company not only removed messages deemed taboo by the CCP, but also did not inform any users that their content had been censored. A Pan America report released in 2018 stated that an activist from the Xinjiang region was sentenced to 19 years in prison after his posts on WeChat were used as evidence for his alleged crimes. In fact, Tencent blatantly admits to WeChat users that it will, quote, retain, preserve, or disclose their data to comply with applicable laws or regulations, unquote, which essentially translates into, we will give the government access to your data whenever they request it. Since WeChat is the most popular messaging platform in China, users have no option other than to accept the privacy policy to use the app. Though Tencent's investment in Reddit might not bring in any WeChat censorship, the fact that an organization known to blindly obey the CCP's demands now has a stake in one of America's most visited websites is indeed very disconcerting. And it doesn't end with Tencent. There's also Alibaba, ByteDance, famously the creators of TikTok and several others. But of all these tech giants, Tencent is the most relevant because of their intimate ties to the gaming industry and their hands on the rudder of so many game developers. Tencent will indubitably continue to buy up gaming companies, developers, and publishers, and everything else they can, always with an eye towards expansion and always with an even greater adherence to CCP restrictions and requirements. The question of how dangerous this is a very relevant one, and perhaps some might downplay it as harmless. But the reality we now find ourselves in is such that the CCP, Tencent's master, released a global pandemic upon the world that is running the economy into the ground and costing untold numbers of lives. And as such, I don't think we can really afford to ignore this any longer. And therefore, as gamers and consumers of entertainment, we must ask ourselves what we can do, as admittedly fairly insignificant individuals, to hit entities such as Tencent where it hurts. Now, I can only speak for myself, but in the future and the present, I will do my utmost to avoid purchasing games I know are developed under the auspices of Tencent and the CCP. And this is particularly relevant right now as the game Valorant, being developed by Riot Games, fully owned by Tencent, is being touted as the next Overwatch, with major players and streamers promoting it and singing its praises. Maybe you're even considering getting it. And whether you do or not, that decision is ultimately up to you. But I can tell you for my part, I won't be touching it. And though I think it's certainly not going to be the case, I hope it's a colossal failure. Boycott it if you can. And if you haven't played Path of Exile yet, do the same. Don't give Tencent and the CCP your money if you don't have to. Now, I'm under no illusions about the ultimate impact of such small, insignificant gestures. But awareness of the threat of both Tencent and the CCP needs to start somewhere in order to halt the progress of the new red menace and the pestilence it's released upon us. And as such, think of it simply as a call for greater awareness of just how knee-deep we are in China's manure. Thank you very much for watching. As this channel operates solely off of the generosity and contributions of its subscribers, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Any and all support is more than appreciated. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.